Last week, we spoke about different types of fabrics. I'm sure some of that information was overwhelming because you learned probably about a fabric you didn't know about, or you didn't know there were so many categories of fabrics, or maybe you just even didn't know that fabrics are blended. So this week, we are going to talk about how to test those fabrics. Why do you need to test them? You need to know if the fabric you are using is natural, synthetic, or a blend. And the reason why is maybe because you're very conscious about the fabrics you use for your garments. And not forget that there are some certain fabrics that are only good for certain things. And not all of them are very obvious to the touch. And not all fabric manufacturers are honest with the fabrics that they produce. So sometimes it's also just good to know the kind of fabric you're receiving. It's also always good to have samples, as I had mentioned last week, that there are fabric sellers who give you samples. They're called swatches, and basically those swatches are for testing, to see if you like the quality of the fabric and all that before you order in bulk. And also good for gauging future orders so that you always manage to compare it with these samples. So do invest in these samples. I will insert the clip at the end so that you can see what they look like, and I guess let's see how we test fabrics. Let's start. So there are various methods of testing fabric. Some are a bit obvious by the features, how they feel, how shiny they look, and all that. You can kind of tell if this is a natural or synthetic fabric. Things like satin, automatically you know that it is synthetic. But maybe if you come across silk, you might not know. You might actually think it's a different type of satin. So how would you be able to tell the difference between silk and satin? Another thing is a fabric like rayon, which is very similar to cotton. But cotton is very different from rayon, and rayon goes through a chemical process so that it's made, but cotton is completely natural. So how would you know which one is rayon and which one is cotton? Which is why it's important to know how to test the fabric. So I am going to talk about the different ways, and I'm going to do it in slide form as I usually do. Maybe I'll include a chart at the end, and of course you can take screenshots of them. And you can also consider the method that I think works for majority people, which is the burn method. I'm going to really emphasize that a lot because the way the fabric looks at the end of the burning test, whether it shrivels up or turns into white ash or black ash or gray ash, we will tell you what kind of fabric it is. I'm not sure how it really works with blends. You might be able to tell a difference, but I think just knowing the different types of fabric helps. How they react with fire and everything really helps. So let's start with the slides as usual. So we begin with ways fabrics are tested. So we are going to start with the international standard because there is an international standard for testing fabrics, mostly usually done for manufacturers of fabrics or textiles as they're called, but it's also usually very good information for if you buy textiles in large quantities, small quantities, whatever. It's always good to know which tests have been done on them, because sometimes when you're buying, you ask what test has been done on this, then they have the certifications and stuff like that. So it's just important to know what the tests are. So textile testing is a scientific technique and method to evaluate whether the quality textile meets requirements of specific standards. This is by analyzing and studying the influence of the product by composition, structure, and properties of textiles and determine the use value of the textile. So basically how it's used as well. So the main purpose is to check quality and suitability, monitor the production process, assess quality, investigate faulty materials, set standards of benchmarks, research and development, for new development. So basically during this process, you might find that they find, oh, this cotton takes dye this way, but sometimes it fades with time. So this is now what we're going to do to add things. So basically this process is not just to make sure that the quality is maintained, but it's also to improve the quality of the fabrics we get, and also to come up with new products. And there's a whole science, I guess, behind all this. So it's always just important to know that this is it. So there are 3 classifications of testing these textiles internationally. So I'm going to go through each of them one by one. So the first one is classification according to textile application. So every step of the textile production process cannot be separated from testing. Basically from the fibers to the yarns, and then from the yarns to the fabric. So that whole process is tested. And then the fabrics and the textile products are most widely used, and there are many test items. So common textile products are apparel, basically the clothes you wear, household stuff, things you use around the house, like, things for furniture and stuff like that. Medical, because there's things like medical gauzes and stuff like that. Industrial, military, arts and craft, and so much more. So they're basically tested according to their use, and the example is below there. So the next method of testing is classified according to test standards. So there's an international test standard. I'm sure ISO is something that is very familiar with most people, but it seems like majority countries in the West also have their own test standard, and of course China and Japan and Korea being the ones in the East that have their own standards. So they also have very specific fabrics that they allow in their countries, and there are some fabrics they do not allow in their countries depending on the content. So they might subject your things, depending on what it is you're sending there, to their tests before they are accepted. And especially I think if you're really exporting big amounts of textiles to their country, or so it's just good to know what the tests are, and in a nutshell that's what they are. And I'm sure you can actually search. I always write the source at the bottom so that you can learn more, because there are always links to these things that you can check. So lastly, there is a classification according to the textile properties. So it could be how it looks, appearance, durability, the performance for safety, and the comfort test. So there are also various ways. These are probably mostly done scientifically, so it's not like what you do at home, home test, because of course there's a home version of this, or a non-industrial version of doing all this, but I guess this is mostly for bulk production. So there is classification according to this as well, and then I'm sure it's all certified and everything. So I think it's just good to have this information. I know it's a lot, and this video is more text than pictures, like I've been doing with the other videos, but this is just a resource for you to be able to always refer to every time you need to know more. So now we can look at ways you can test fabric. So before I get to the promised burn method, there are other ways you can test fabric. One of them is touch and feel. Sometimes you can be very sensitive to a certain fabric that you use, and when you touch and feel it, you'd know. There's the flame retardancy, basically to see how flammable a fabric is. Maybe you burn it. It's part of the burn method, but this one is more about how long the flame, if it can even catch the flame, basically, because there's a way to actually treat fabric that it doesn't get flammable. There's the abrasion. Basically, can it withstand wear and tear? I can give you a good example, especially when you're wearing your denim jeans, and maybe denim is usually tougher because of thigh friction. So abrasion, that's a good way to show you or to explain. Or maybe you work in construction and you're always around rough surfaces, so abrasion would be important. So color fastness to light, basically, does it fade quickly after a period of time because of putting it in light and everything like that. Sometimes it even informs how to care for the fabric. Peeling, basically those fuzzy balls you see on top of your fabric, especially when washing or how your fabric care is done. Peeling, then there's seam spillage, the conditions when the fabric is pulled apart. Does it easily come apart? And then the tear strength, like how much force do you really need to tear it. So these are just simple ones that you can use. So now we go to the fabric burn test. So before I get into the basics, I have to explain more about the conditions you need to do this. But before that, I found a nice little chart on Instagram, and I thought this would be very, very nice if you just want a very simplified version of the burn test. So do have a look at it, take a screenshot. I think you can look for by hand London on Instagram and find the chart. So I just thought to share it, but at least it gives you a rough idea of what we're going to discuss in the burn test. So now we get into what you need to do the test. So of course you need a piece of fabric, it's written there. You need a ceramic pot or a steel pot. It's like basically something that won't catch fire when you're using it to burn your fabric. And you need a tweezer, because I don't think it's a good idea to touch it with your hands. Gloves, no. No, just use tweezers. So next, how to burn test for fabric. So you light a match, you look at the flame, that actually matters. You record that, you look at how it shrinks, you smell it, what does it smell like, you write that down, and then you see what is left after it has burned. You write that down, what color does it look, you press it gently and all that. Trust me, all that is important. So in natural fabrics, the fabrics will catch fire easily. They will burn with a yellow flame. They will have an afterglow, and they will leave a soft ash gray or white residue. With synthetic fabric, it will burn and melt when ignited and continue to burn after the flame is removed from the fabric, and they will smoke as they burn, and this may be toxic, so don't breathe it in. In fact, wear a mask if you have to. Actually, that should be in one of the things you need. And also take precaution and leave the plastic, and then it leaves the plastic like a bead residue. So just to help you out, of course not all the fabrics will be the same. I found a nice chart in the same site, and I just figured that this will help you depending on the fabric you're using. Of course, it doesn't have all the fabrics in the world, but I thought that these charts would be very, very helpful as a resource, because it writes for you the reaction of the flame, the burning behavior, the smell you can expect, and what happens after the flame has burnt down, and the type of ash it will form. So I'm sure some of you are going to run tests with this, and I'm sure it's going to be helpful, but I just thought that I don't want to make this video too long, because it's mostly text. There's no pictures like previous videos, and this is mostly a resource. So I hope this has been very helpful to you, and now we conclude. So I hope the information on testing your fabrics has been helpful, and I know the burn method is probably the easiest way to know. There is advice that's usually given sometimes, especially if you're going to ship your clothes internationally, because there are some countries that are very particular with the content of fabric, what is inside, or even knowing the source, the pesticides that were used. Some countries are very particular, so sometimes you're advised to actually go and test your fabric in a lab, get the information, and then proceed to do your production. So just understand that testing fabric is part of the process, and if at least you know the origin of fabric, and you just get directly from people who maybe have silk farms where they produce fabric directly, or cotton farms, and you know it's from farm to factory or whatever, then at least you are better off. But it's very, very important to know where your fabric comes from and what is inside, and the processes that were used. Sometimes the fabric itself is fine, but the dye that was used is the one that is harmful for the environment, because don't forget that while your client is wearing the outfit, the dye might be toxic, it might affect their skin, it might affect the water as they wash and the water is drained. So there are very many things to consider when testing fabric. So next week we're going to talk about laundry symbols. I know you've seen those symbols on your clothes tags, especially if you're used to buying clothes that are in a shop. It's actually a requirement that you give care instructions on clothes when you are selling them to people on ready-to-wear space. So we're going to talk more about that. Maybe you've been seeing them and you don't know what they mean, or maybe you just wash all your clothes the same way, and that is actually a mistake. So we'll get into it next week. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I appreciate your support. See you next week. Bye.